Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marcia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, the end of an era is what is being said about the death of revolutionary Cuban leader Fidel Castro. He died at the age of 90 after a lifetime of fighting against imperialism while being on the doorstep of the United States. Now, he led the revolution to throw out the pro-Washington regime of Batista and continued to fight for the independence and dignity of his people as long as he was healthy. We'll look at his legacy and the future of Cuba without the man known as Comandante on this debate. I'd like to welcome my guest, starting off actually in Washington, D.C., founder American Institute for Foreign Policy, Mr. Michael Lane. Thank you so much for being with us. Your overall perspective about Fidel Castro.
Well, it certainly is the end of an era. Castro has ruled Cuba since 1960. That's an incredibly long time. I don't think his legacy will be particularly good. The island of Cuba is not in good shape. The economy is not in good shape. The people are not in good shape. Their freedoms, their individual and personal freedoms, are virtually non-existent. There's really no reason other than the fact that you're stuck there for people to want to live in Cuba these days. With Fidel Castro now gone, his brother Raul has the chance to see whether or not he's going to exercise some independence and lead Cuba in a new direction of cooperation with the world, particularly its closest and most logical trading partner, the United States. But it is up to the leader of Cuba, Raul Castro, to decide whether or not he wants to continue Fidel's legacy of firing squads and oppression, or whether he wants to reach out and take advantage of the opening that President Obama has given him.
Okay, well, let me welcome next guest to the program out of New York, the International Action Center, Ms. Sarah Flanders. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm not sure if you heard our previous guest. Basically, he said that Fidel Castro's legacy was basically of oppression, death, and destruction. Your take, Sarah Flanders, on Fidel Castro, your overall perspective.
Well, let me begin by saying I join the people of Cuba and the struggling people of the whole world in mourning the loss and paying respect to really a great revolutionary leader of our era. Fidel Castro was absolutely an internationalist, and he was a unique and leading figure. He was intransigent against capitalism. He was consciously a socialist leader of enormous proportion, and he defied U.S. imperialism right on its doorstep again and again, and rebuilt Cuba from a backward, impoverished country that was a playground for the wealthiest capitalists into the highest standard of living, the highest standard of medical care, and more Cuban doctors that function around the world in the poorest countries and the World Health Organization. Cuba really is an example of what is possible when capitalism is overturned, when people are consciously committed to building socialism, and when they're internationalists. Cuba played a huge role in the struggle against apartheid in Southern Africa, against colonialism, and a revolutionary force in Latin America. So this is really an outsized human figure that allowed Cuba, a small country, to play an enormous role for liberation of all people.
Okay, well, Michael Lane, of course, you have a different perspective on things, but if we look at the role the CIA and other Washington agencies played in trying over 600 times to assassinate Fidel Castro, my question to you would be, why would a country like the U.S. in 1959 had a population of 180 million fear a country with a population of 7 million?
Well, I will say I do respect President Castro as a survivalist, a man who, against a lot of odds, was able to keep himself firmly ensconced at the top of the Cuban dictatorship. There were many attempts, as you point out, from outside sources to have him removed from office. There were many attempts, revolts of the Cuban people, to exercise their freedom and liberty and to remove him from office, all of which failed. The only thing that was able to remove Fidel Castro from office was the natural progression of age and, of course, his failing health. I think that...
What do you think, though, Michael Lane, when you hear that your government has been involved in trying to assassinate a leader like Fidel Castro? Is this okay with you? Of course, we know it's not just Fidel Castro, but is it okay?
You know, those things are not legal in the United States anymore. There was a time years ago when that was not only legal, but considered to be not that out of the ordinary for leaders to be dealt with like that. We have new legislation, I believe it's some 30 years old in the United States, that prevents us from taking part in that particular kind of activity. But I think you have to look at it in the context of the times. You know, there were a number of American corporations and American citizens that had their property stolen from them, about $1.7 billion in 1960 dollars. That Castro just nationalized without any particular authority, and et cetera. But even more important than that was his then alliance with the Soviet Union, which allowed him, which he allowed his bases and his island to be used for the Soviet Union to set up intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed directly at the United States.
Hold on a second. Many would say that it was actually Washington that forced Cuba to actually get closer to the Soviet Union, because looking at history after the revolution, actually the Cubans reestablished relations with the United States, but it was the United States consistently trying to overthrow the newly revolutionary government that basically Cuba had no choice but to go to the Soviet Union in order to survive. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I would disagree with that. Look, you know, Castro was an illegal government. He took, he took office by virtue of an illegal revolution. Now, you can argue, and I would take the point that, you know, if you have a revolution, if you win, that de facto makes you legal. So Castro won the revolution. He was able to depose President Batista, and he took over as the leader of the Cuban people. But he had ambitions. Castro was a very bright guy who really had worldwide ambitions, and he knew that Cuba was too small a jumping pad for him to get there. So he specifically sought out the Soviet Union, knowing the conflict that could be caused vis-a-vis the United States, and put Cuba right in the middle of that in an effort to make himself and Cuba more important on the world stage.
Okay, Sarah
I don't think we drove him anyplace. He could have gotten along with us.
Your take, because Fidel would tell the Cuban people not to fear the United States and to be self-reliant. This in the face of many sanctions and boycotts by the United States. And currently in Cuba, 57 years after the revolution, there's almost 100% literacy. Education and health care is free in the country, and homelessness is extremely rare. Your take. Go ahead.
All right, this is exactly true. This is the enormous accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution, of Fidel Castro's leadership, and of the determination. Revolutionary ideas are not just ideas in the mind. They have to be fought for and defended. And really, Fidel showed how to do that, that never for a moment did U.S. imperialism stop trying to overturn violently the Cuban Revolution. And the 638 assassination attempts, years of blockade and sanctions, so many efforts of sabotage. It was nonstop. And yet Cuba not only survived and thrived and was a resource and is a resource now for people around the world, Haiti, Venezuela, throughout Latin America, throughout Africa. As I say, more doctors, more health care, more technicians than the World Health Organization provides. So that is a real accomplishment. Now, the Cuban Revolution burst forward at the height of the Cold War, and it broke that whole period right here in the U.S. The Cuban Revolution, it's very survival from the Bay of Pigs invasion by the U.S., just one act of sabotage. They had to defend themselves, and they beat back U.S. efforts again and again. And it's also important to recognize that they survived because the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries came to their defense. But even after the collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union, it was Cuba's determination, socialism or death, to survive as a socialist country. They had to make accommodations. There were enormous shortages, but they said this will be shared by all the people of Cuba, and we will rebuild and move forward. Now, that was a real example, not to be demoralized or dismayed. So I think we need to take those real lessons on a world scale. They played a big, big role.
All right, stay with me, Sarah Flanders. Sorry, I want to cross over and check out our Facebook comments on this subject.
Love him or hate him, one thing is undeniable. Fidel Castro, leader of a small Caribbean island, left his mark on the world and put Cuba at the center of world events. A great man, the man who gave Cuba to her people. To me, the name Fidel Castro is like a subtitle to the term revolution. Adios, Presidente. He led Cubans to poverty. What a shame. A real leader, a real man, a real hero. He wasn't a puppet. He will stay a symbol of true freedom. Rest in peace. Viva Cuba. A great man, only Americans hated him, while the whole world loves him. A big loss to the world.
Well, what about that, Michael Lane? One of the last comments says that the whole world loved him. Only Americans, and it seems some Americans, especially the American government, hated him. Is it that the American government, if we look at whether we're talking about going back from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Obama of today, is it that the American system in place will fight any revolutionary around the world if the corporate corporate entities actually will be put for a loss? It appears that corporations and interests more important than people and people's right. Your take, sir?
Well, I think they're both important. I mean, you know, people certainly have rights. There were a lot of Cubans that had their private property confiscated. Castro brought to the new Cuba, the revolutionary Cuba, the concept that there was no such thing as private property, that people were not allowed to own it, the corporations were not allowed to own it. I mentioned previously that there are $1.7 billion in claims against the Cuban government back in 1960. Well, with interest, those claims have grown to $6 or $7 billion at this particular point in time. And the Helms-Burton Act in the United States requires that those claims be settled prior to normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States. So I don't think we're going to come up on that anytime soon. Look, the fact is it was the Cuban people who were oppressed. It was the Cuban people who had their freedoms taken away. It was the Cuban people, the lucky ones, were able to flee Cuba and get to the United States. But the rest of the Cubans there, I really, you know, if we hold them up as a success story, I'd hate to see what an economic failure is. There's
Sir, you don't think literacy rate at almost 100% is a success, or having a country where education is free even throughout graduate school is a success? If we look at, with all the pressure that the Cubans have been under because of course, many sanctions and boycotts on them, with the country just 350 miles north of them, being the United States, wouldn't you consider that a success?
Well, in and of itself, it is, but it can't be judged in and of itself. Look, if you look around the world and you look at countries that have good education systems, that have widespread literacy, those countries are among the countries that are most economically successful, that have managed to mostly eradicate poverty. The single best way out of poverty is education and literacy, but yet you look at Cuba with its widespread literacy and universal education, and it was never able to escape almost universal poverty for its people.
What about that,
and
Sarah Flanders? Your take on what Mr. Lane has said.
Well, Cuba is such an example of a socialist experiment where it's property rights versus people's rights. People in Cuba previously had no right to education, to health care, to housing, to a future, because there were rights for a tiny handful to have enormous property, plantations, and a playground, really. So the Cuban Revolution was that break. It made that fundamental change, and it made an enormous change for the people of Cuba, and then what they are able to bring to people all around the world. And that difference, we can look at the U.S. today, where people are getting poorer and poorer in the richest capitalist country in the world. And you see the example of Cuba under blockade, under sanctions, that is keeping this country, which is isolated. The blockade absolutely continues. There's some travel that's opened up, a little bit of exchanges, but for most part, the U.S. blockade of Cuba and the sabotage continues. So that has kept Cuba much poorer than it by rights would be, should be. That's true. And yet, look, even in spite of the blockade, what they have achieved. It's pretty incredible for the entire population, not just for the privileged handful who came to the U.S. because they wanted their privilege, they wanted their position continued, and they didn't care about the entire Cuban people.
Okay.
And the Cuban Revolution has shown it is possible to care for the entire people and make an enormous change in their lives.
Well, Mr. Lane, would you say that Fidel instilled in his people a confidence and a sense of independence that they could accomplish anything? And I want to know if you agree with that, how will that play in the future of Cuba, in your perspective?
No, I think, look, the Cuban people didn't have it great under Batista. I don't know if anybody is going to ever argue that. It was not a great regime. In fact, it was a regime with many faults that needed to be corrected. But Fidel Castro did not bring a positive improvement to the people of Cuba. In fact, he brought oppression, and he brought poverty, and he brought the lack of freedoms. And so the Cuban people did not have instilled with them a new pride, a new strength. What they had instilled in them was a new fear, a fear that if they contradicted or if they opposed the dictator Fidel Castro, they would be murdered, they would be executed, they would face a firing squad. That's what Fidel Castro did with his political opponents. So I think the underlying optimism of the Cuban people is still there, but it was nothing instilled by Fidel Castro, and I certainly think the Cuban people are looking forward to a post-Castro era in which they might begin to reclaim some of their freedoms.
Okay, well, Ms. Flanders, first Fidel was allied with his friend Che Guevara to reach victory in the revolution. And in later years, he was allied with the late revolutionary leader of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. Now, they all had a vision to liberate all of Latin America from the clutches of hegemony. How successful were they?
Well, of course, the CIA assassinated Che Guevara and stopped the efforts in Bolivia. And as they really brought a reign of death and dictatorship throughout Latin America for decades. Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia today are really a break with that, an enormous break. And Fidel Castro played a big role in both welcoming and in every way doing what small Cuba could to push this forward. So I think the people of Latin America, the people of Africa very much are thankful to what the Cuban Revolution was able to do.
Okay, and Mr. Lane, do you see a revolutionary Latin America on the horizon? Or, as we have seen recently, there is a movement out of Washington to overthrow the more progressive elements in the region. The future of the region, in your perspective?
Well, Fidel Castro was successful in exporting his revolutionary spirit and supporting revolutionary ideas with Cuban troops and things like that throughout Latin America, creating some levels of difficulty for United States foreign policy and hegemony throughout the hemisphere over here. But in the future, I think that with Raul Castro being the sole surviving member whose time is limited as well as a leader of Cuba, it remains to be seen where they go. I don't think that Latin America is going to foment a wave of revolutions, a wave of communists. Look, let's look at the world. There has never been a single successful experiment with communism as the form of government on the face of the planet. Everybody who's tried it has failed at it. So I don't think that we're going to see Latin Americans embrace that. I think President-elect Donald Trump has a new opportunity to reset relations and to work with our American states as partners throughout our hemisphere and our region. I believe he will do that, and I'd like to have this conversation again in 2 years and see where we are on that.
And Sarah Flanders, what would you say is the legacy of Fidel Castro and the overall direction now of a post-Fidel Cuba?
Well, I think his legacy is that revolutionary ideas can transform society if there's really an overturn of the capitalist relations, of the domination of U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism and its stranglehold on countries around the world means military dictatorship, enormous poverty, relentless war, sectarian divisions. That is what U.S. imperialism means. So pushing that back is a huge accomplishment, giving an example of what socialism can accomplish. And there are millions of Cubans who are determined to defend and protect that legacy. That's what the U.S. is up against. Donald Trump, with his racist, sexist, Islamophobic, reactionary ideas, is hated around the world before he's even in office. But Fidel Castro is mourned because of what he accomplished, what he showed was possible even for a small country. And this gives people around the world great confidence to continue in the struggle for socialism, for independence, for a break with U.S. imperialism.
And on that note, I'd like to thank both of my guests for being with us here on the debate. The founder of American Institute for Foreign Policy, Mr. Michael Lane, out of Washington, D.C., and from the International Action Center, Ms. Sarah Flanders, out of New York. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. See you next time.